Welcome back. This is Midnight Crime. If you enjoy falling asleep to these stories, feel free to like the video and subscribe. And before we begin, what time is it where you are, and where are you listening from tonight? Alright, let's head straight into our first story. Case 1. The woman who lived across the hall had disappeared overnight. Her apartment door was wide open, lights still on, and her belongings untouched. But a single item, a scarf with a faint scent of smoke, was left hanging on the doorknob, as if someone wanted her to notice. She stood in the hallway longer than she meant to, the strap of her bag pressing into her shoulder as if reminding her she had somewhere else to be. The scarf moved slightly where it hung, stirred by a draft she couldn't feel anywhere else. It was thin, pale gray, the kind that held creases from being folded too neatly. One corner had darkened, not quite a stain, more like something brushed against it and stayed. She didn't touch it at first. Inside the apartment, a lamp near the window cast a warm circle across the floor. It stopped just short of the doorway, as though the light itself hesitated to spill into the hall. Everything beyond that looked untouched. A chair angled slightly away from the table. A glass of water on the counter, filled nearly to the top. No sign of a struggle. No sign of anything interrupted. Only absence. She reached out, finally, and slid the scarf off the doorknob. The fabric was colder than she expected. When she lifted it closer, the smell became clearer, not sharp like fresh smoke, but something older settled into the threads, like it had been near smoke for a long time and then carried somewhere else. Behind her, a door clicked open. Mrs. Ilyina from 3B stepped into the hallway with a plastic bag of trash, pausing when she saw her. Her eyes moved quickly, taking in the open apartment, the scarf in her hand. She left. Mrs. Ilyina asked, though it didn't sound like a question. "I don't know," she said. "The door was like this." Mrs. Ilyina didn't come closer. She stayed near her own doorway, holding the bag a little tighter. "Lights were on all night," she said after a moment. "I thought maybe she forgot something, or was packing." "Did you hear anything?" A small shake of the head. "No, just the elevator once, late. Around, maybe 2. Hard to say." She hesitated, then added, "It stopped on this floor." The hallway seemed narrower suddenly, the walls closer together. Did she usually go out that late? Mrs. Ilyina gave a faint shrug. She kept to herself. Always polite, always quiet. Her gaze flicked to the scarf. "That's not hers." "You're sure?" "I've seen her wear scarves," she said. "Brighter ones. Patterns. That one," she paused. "That one looks like it belongs somewhere else." The elevator at the end of the hall chimed softly, empty when the door slid open. The sound echoed longer than it should have. Mrs. Ilyina took that as her moment to leave. "You should call someone," she said, almost under her breath, before stepping inside and closing her door with a careful, controlled motion. The hallway returned to stillness. She stepped into the apartment. The air inside felt different, not stale, but settled, as if it had already adjusted to the idea that no one was coming back. The scent of the scarf lingered faintly now that she was holding it, mixing with something else she couldn't place. Not unpleasant, just unfamiliar. Her shoes made almost no sound on the floor. On the kitchen counter, next to the glass of water, sat a phone charger with no phone attached. The cord trailed off the edge, the end resting just above the floor. It swayed slightly when she brushed past it, a small, quiet movement that took too long to stop. She glanced toward the bedroom. The door was open. The bed was made, but not tightly. One side of the blanket dipped slightly, like someone had sat there not long ago. A book lay face down near the pillow, its spine bent just enough to show it had been left mid-sentence. She didn't go in. Instead, she moved toward the window. Outside, the street looked the same as it always did at this hour. Dim pools of light under the lamps. A car parked slightly crooked near the curb. The distant flicker of a television in another building. Nothing suggested anything unusual had happened. But when she looked closer, she noticed something on the glass. A faint mark near the edge of the frame. Not quite a fingerprint. More like a smudge drawn downward, as if someone had rested their hand there and then slowly pulled it away. She reached out, hovering her fingers just above it without touching. The scarf slipped slightly in her other hand, and the smell rose again, stronger this time. It didn't belong to the apartment. It didn't belong to the hallway. It belonged to somewhere else entirely. She turned back toward the door. From this angle, she could see the hallway beyond, framed by the open doorway. The light from inside stretched out across the floor, stopping just before the elevator. For a moment, she had the strange feeling that something had been standing there earlier, not long ago, watching the apartment the same way she was now. The feeling passed quickly, but not completely. She stepped back into the hall and closed the apartment door halfway, leaving it just as she had found it. The scarf remained in her hand. Downstairs, she remembered, there was a small laundry room, rarely used at night. Sometimes people left things there by mistake. Sometimes things stayed there longer than they should. She started toward the elevator, then stopped. The stairwell door was closer and quieter. She pushed it open. The air inside was cooler, carrying a faint echo of damp concrete, and something else, something that made her tighten her grip on the scarf without realizing it. The smell matched. Not exactly, but close enough to notice. She stood there for a moment, listening. Far below, a door creaked. Then, nothing. She stayed in the doorway of the stairwell longer than she needed to, her hand still resting on the metal bar. The air inside carried that same faint trace, something dry, almost ashy, but softened by time. Not the sharp smell of something recently burned. Older. Settled. She stepped in and let the door close behind her. The sound folded into the concrete space and disappeared. The stairs curved down in short flights, each landing lit by a small wall fixture that cast a pale, uneven glow. The paint along the rail had worn thin in places, exposing darker metal beneath. Someone had run their hand along it many times in the same spots. She moved slowly, one step at a time, her shoes brushing lightly against the edges of the stairs. The scarf hung loosely from her fingers now, its fabric shifting with each movement. Every few steps, she caught the scent again, stronger near the walls, as though it had settled into the building itself. On the first landing, she paused. There was a mark on the floor near the corner. Not a stain exactly. More like a smudge that had been partially wiped away. Gray against gray. Easy to miss unless you were looking for something that didn't belong. She crouched slightly, tilting her head. It wasn't just one mark. There were faint streaks leading toward the next flight down, uneven and interrupted, as if something had been carried rather than dragged. Whatever had made them hadn't been heavy enough to leave deep traces, but it had left something behind. She straightened and continued. The air grew cooler as she descended, the smell sharpening just enough to be more noticeable. Not overwhelming, just present. On the next landing, she heard something. A soft shift, not movement exactly. More like the building settling, or a door closing somewhere far below. She waited, holding her breath without realizing it. Nothing followed. She kept going. When she reached the bottom, the stairwell opened into a narrow corridor that led to the basement rooms. The overhead light flickered once, then steadied. The walls here were rougher, unfinished in places, with exposed pipes running along the ceiling. To the left, a door stood slightly ajar. The laundry room. She approached it slowly, her hand brushing the wall as she moved. The surface felt cool and slightly damp. The smell was stronger here, no longer faint or uncertain. It lingered in the air, woven into it. She pushed the door open. Inside, the machines sat in 2 rows, their surfaces dull under the overhead light. One of them hummed quietly, mid-cycle, though no one else was there. A thin vibration traveled through the floor, subtle but constant. A plastic basket rested on top of one of the dryers. Empty, except for a single sock folded neatly in half. It didn't match anything nearby. She stepped further in. Near the back wall, a small table held a few forgotten items. A bottle of detergent, half full, a handful of coins, a crumpled receipt. Nothing unusual, nothing that stood out, except for the chair. It had been pulled slightly away from the table, angled toward the door. Not enough to be obvious, but enough to suggest it hadn't been left that way by accident. She moved closer to it. The fabric of the seat was worn, the edges frayed. On one side, near the seam, there was a faint discoloration. She leaned in, bringing the scarf closer without thinking. The smell aligned. Not identical, but close enough that it settled into place in her mind. Whatever had left that scent on the scarf had been here, too, or something like it. She straightened slowly. The washing machine behind her clicked, shifting into a news cycle. The sudden change in sound made her glance back, though nothing had moved. When she turned again, her gaze fell to the floor near the chair. A small object lay partially tucked beneath it. She crouched and reached for it, her fingers brushing against something smooth and cool. She pulled it into the light. A key, not a modern one. Slightly longer, heavier, with a simple bow and no markings she could see at first glance. It wasn't attached to anything. No keychain, no tag. She turned it over in her hand. There was a faint residue along one edge, barely visible. Gray, like the marks on the stairs. She rubbed it gently with her thumb. It smudged, leaving a faint streak on her skin. She looked back at the chair. It faced the door, as if someone had been sitting there, waiting. The thoughts settled in quietly, without urgency, just a possibility among others. She stood and moved toward the far corner of the room, where a narrow hallway branched off. It led to a storage area, small units assigned to each apartment. Most of the doors were closed, some secured with padlocks, others left with simple latches. The air in the hallway was heavier. She stepped into it, the light dimmer here, casting longer shadows along the floor. The smell followed her, not stronger, but more contained. Halfway down, she noticed one of the doors wasn't fully shut. It sat slightly open, just enough to reveal darkness inside. She slowed. There was no number on the door, or if there had been, it had worn away over time. The edges of the frame were scuffed, as though it had been opened and closed more often than the others. She reached out and pushed it gently. The door moved with a soft, uneven sound. Inside, the space was small. Bare concrete walls, a low ceiling, a single overhead bulb that didn't turn on when she searched for a switch. The only light came from the hallway behind her, stretching into the room in a narrow strip. In that strip of light, she could see the outline of a few items. A box, a folded chair, a coat hanging from a hook on the wall. She stepped closer. The coat was dark, heavier than anything needed for the current weather. One sleeve hung lower than the other, as if it had been taken off in a hurry and not adjusted afterward. She reached out and touched the fabric. Cold. The smell was there, unmistakable now. Not just on the scarf, not just in the stairwell. Here. Her hand moved along the sleeve, feeling the texture, the slight stiffness in certain areas. Near the cuff, her fingers brushed against something rougher. She paused, then brought the edge of the sleeve closer to the light. There, along the seam, was a faint line of gray residue, the same as before, the same quiet trace that had followed her from the hallway, down the stairs, into this room. Behind her, somewhere in the basement, a door closed. Not loudly, just enough to be heard. She turned her head slightly, listening. The sound didn't repeat. The building settled again into its usual stillness. She remained where she was, one hand still resting lightly on the coat, the other holding the scarf and the key. For a moment, nothing moved. Then, from somewhere above, faint and distant, the elevator chimed. The sound lingered for a moment, then dissolved into the building's usual quiet. She stayed still, listening for anything that might follow. Footsteps above, a door opening, voices passing through the ceiling. Nothing came, only the low, constant presence of the pipe somewhere behind the walls, carrying something unseen through the structure. Her hand slipped away from the coat. She stepped back into the hallway, letting her eyes adjust again to the dim light. The storage door remained open behind her, the edge of it casting a thin shadow across the floor. For a second, she considered closing it, but left it as it was. The key felt heavier now. She moved further down the corridor, slower than before, her shoulder grazing the rough wall. Each door she passed carried small differences, some with new locks, some with older metal that had dulled unevenly, some marked faintly with pencil numbers that had been half erased over time. Near the end of the row, one door stood out. It had a newer lock, brighter than the others, catching what little light reached this far. The metal hadn't yet gathered the same, whereas everything around it. The edges of the door frame were cleaner too, as if they had been wiped recently. She stopped in front of it. The key in her hand didn't match at first glance. The shapes were different, the lock more modern. Still, she lifted it slightly, turning it between her fingers, as if expecting something to align. It didn't, but when she lowered her hand, her gaze dropped to the floor. Just in front of the door, there were faint marks again. Not the same streaks as the stairwell. These were smaller, more scattered, like dust disturbed and then settled again, but not evenly. A few patches looked darker, compressed. She shifted her foot slightly, careful not to step directly on them. The air here felt still, heavier than the rest of the corridor. The smell lingered faintly, but it didn't seem to come from inside the unit. It drifted past, like something carried through rather than stored. She leaned in closer to the door. There was a narrow gap along the bottom, barely noticeable. No light came through it. No sound either. She stayed there for a few seconds, then straightened. From somewhere behind her, back toward the laundry room, the machine clicked again, followed by the soft rush of water stopping. The sudden quiet that followed made the space feel more enclosed. She turned and walked back the way she had come. The chair in the laundry room hadn't moved. The basket remained where it was, the single sock undisturbed. The machine had gone still now, its cycle complete, the hum replaced by a faint ticking as it cooled. She set the key on the table for a moment and adjusted the scarf in her hand. The fabric had warmed slightly from her grip, but the scent hadn't faded. If anything, it had settled deeper, becoming more noticeable the longer she held it. Her eyes moved across the room again, slower this time. On the far side, near the sink, there was a small shelf she hadn't noticed before. It was tucked into the corner, partially hidden behind a stack of folded cloths. The top layer looked clean, recently washed. Beneath them, the edges of older fabric showed through, slightly yellowed, not used as often. She crossed the room and reached for the stack. The top cloths shifted easily, light and soft. Underneath, the lower ones felt different. Heavier, stiffer. She lifted one. The smell rose again. Not strong, but present enough to connect it to everything else. The fabric itself looked ordinary, but one corner had darkened in the same uneven way as the scarf. Not a clear stain, just a change. She folded it back and placed it where it had been. Next to the shelf, the sink basin held a thin layer of water, barely covering the bottom. A faint film had formed on the surface, catching the light in dull patches. She leaned in slightly. There were tiny flecks floating there. Gray, like dust, but heavier. They hadn't dissolved. She dipped her finger into the water without thinking. The surface broke easily. The flecks drifted apart, then slowly came back together. When she lifted her hand, a faint residue clung to her skin, darker when wet. She wiped it against the side of the sink. It left a streak, the same color. She stepped back. For a moment, the room felt smaller. Not because anything had changed, but because the details had begun to align in a way that narrowed the space between them. She picked up the key again. This time, she slipped it into her pocket. The scarf remained in her hand. She turned off the light and stepped out into the basement corridor, pulling the laundry room door closed behind her until it clicked softly into place. The stairwell felt quieter than before. As she climbed, the air shifted gradually, the smell fading with each step upward. By the time she reached the first landing, it had thinned enough to be almost unnoticeable, but not entirely gone. She paused again near the faint marks on the floor. They seemed less distinct now, harder to separate from the surrounding surface. As if, given enough time, they would disappear completely. She continued up. When she pushed the stairwell door open, the hallway greeted her with a familiar stillness. The light from the apartment across the hall remained unchanged, spilling into the corridor just as before. The door was still half open. She approached it again, slower this time. From inside, everything looked the same. The glass of water, the chair, the soft circle of light near the window. But now, standing in the doorway again, she noticed something else. Near the entrance, just inside the threshold, there was a small indentation in the carpet. Not deep, easy to overlook, but it curved slightly, as if something narrow and cylindrical had rested there for a short time. She stepped closer, crouching slightly. The fibers of the carpet were pressed in a way that hadn't yet lifted back. Whatever had made the mark hadn't been there long. She reached out and ran her fingers lightly over it. The shape was consistent. Her gaze shifted to the scarf in her hand. The ends were weighted just enough to create a similar curve if it had been set down in a certain way. Not dropped, placed. She stood slowly. From down the hall, the elevator doors opened again with a soft mechanical sigh. This time, she heard footsteps. Measured, unhurried, approaching. She remained where she was, just inside the doorway, her hand still resting lightly against the frame. The footsteps carried along the hallway at a steady pace, not hurried, not hesitant. Each one landed with a soft, deliberate rhythm that echoed faintly against the walls. There was no attempt to quiet them. She turned her head slightly. A man came into view near the elevator, one hand holding a small paper bag, the other adjusting the sleeve of his coat as he walked. He glanced up briefly, noticing her, then the open apartment behind her. His expression didn't change much, just a small pause in his movement, almost imperceptible. "Doors been open?" he asked. His voice was low, neutral, as if the question didn't carry much weight. "For a while," she said. He nodded once, more to himself than to her, and continued forward. When he passed her, he slowed slightly, his gaze drifting into the apartment for a second longer than necessary. Not searching, just taking it in. Then he moved on. She listened as his footsteps continued down the hall, stopping near the far end where another door opened and closed. The sound settled, leaving the space quiet again. She stepped fully into the apartment this time. The air felt unchanged, but now it held a trace of something else. Movement, recently passed through. Not strong enough to identify, just enough to suggest the space hadn't been completely still. She closed the door halfway again, leaving the same narrow gap as before. The indentation in the carpet remained where she had seen it. She walked past it slowly, careful not to disturb the fibers, and moved further inside. Near the kitchen counter, she noticed something she hadn't before. A second glass. It sat near the sink, partially obscured by the edge of the counter. Unlike the first, it wasn't filled. A faint ring of water circled the inside near the bottom, as if it had been emptied recently but not rinsed. She picked it up. The glass was slightly warmer than the surrounding air. Or perhaps her hands had cooled in the stairwell more than she realized. She turned it slowly, watching the way the light passed through it. Along the rim, there was a faint smudge, not clear enough to be a print, but distinct from the rest of the surface. She held it there for a moment, then set it back down exactly where it had been. Her attention shifted to the table. The chair she had noticed earlier still sat at that slight angle, facing away. But now, standing closer, she could see a small crease in the cushion. Fresh, not deep, but present. Someone had sat there, recently enough that the fabric hadn't fully returned to shape. She moved toward the bedroom again. This time, she stepped inside. The air was cooler here, the window slightly open by an inch or two. A thin curtain stirred with the movement from outside, brushing lightly against the frame in a slow, repeating motion. The bed remained as it was. The book still lay face down. She approached it and turned it over carefully. A page had been folded at the corner, marking the place. The text itself didn't stand out, just lines of print, evenly spaced. But something small caught her attention near the margin. A faint line, drawn lightly in pencil. It wasn't underlining anything specific, just a short mark beside a paragraph, as if someone had intended to come back to it. She leaned in slightly, reading the lines around it without fully focusing on the words. The meaning didn't settle. Only the presence of the mark did. She closed the book and placed it back exactly as she found it. On the nightstand, there was a small dish. Inside it, a few items rested: 2 rings, a hairpin, and a coin. The coin looked older than the others she'd seen downstairs, its surface worn smooth in places. She picked it up. It felt heavier than expected. Turning it over, she noticed a faint discoloration along one edge. Gray, but lighter than the residue in the basement, almost as if it had been wiped. She set it back down. From outside, a car passed, its headlights briefly illuminating the room through the gap in the curtain. The light moved across the walls, then faded, leaving the space dim again. She stepped back into the main room. Her eyes moved once more across the apartment, slower now, connecting details she hadn't noticed together before. The charger without a phone. 2 glasses, one used, one not. The chair, slightly out of place. The scarf, left deliberately at the door. And beneath it all, that faint, persistent scent that didn't belong to anything here. She moved toward the entrance again. The hallway beyond remained quiet, but something had shifted in the air. Not a sound, more like a subtle change in presence. She stepped out and turned to pull the door back to its original position. As she did, her gaze dropped briefly to the floor just outside the threshold. There, near the edge of the light, was a small, flattened piece of something she hadn't seen before. She crouched and picked it up. It was thin, fragile, gray. When she pressed it lightly between her fingers, it crumbled almost instantly, leaving a fine dust behind. She brushed it off her skin. The particles clung for a moment before falling away. She stood at the far end of the hallway. The man who had passed her earlier stood near the window, his back partially turned. He wasn't looking outside. His head was angled slightly, as if listening, not toward her, toward the stairwell. He remained there for a few seconds, then reached into his pocket and pulled something out. A set of keys. He looked at them briefly, then slipped them back in without using them. When he turned, his eyes met hers for a moment. There was nothing in his expression that stood out. No urgency, no surprise, just a brief acknowledgement. Then he walked toward the stairwell door and pushed it open. The door closed behind him with a soft, measured sound. She stood in the hallway, the remains of the gray dust still faintly visible on her fingertips, the scarf hanging quietly at her side. After a moment, she moved, not toward the stairwell, but in the opposite direction, down the hall, past the elevator, toward a door she had never paid much attention to before. It led to a small side entrance of the building, rarely used. The handle was slightly tarnished, the paint around it chipped. She pushed it open. Outside, the air felt cooler, cleaner. The faint scent that had followed her inside didn't carry here. It stopped at the threshold, as though it belonged entirely within the building. A narrow alley stretched behind the structure, dimly lit by a single overhead lamp. Trash bins lined one side, their lids closed but uneven. The ground was rough, scattered with small debris that shifted underfoot. She stepped out. The door closed behind her with a soft click. For a moment, she stood still, letting her eyes adjust. Then she noticed the ground near the base of the wall. A faint trail, not continuous, just small, scattered patches of gray, leading away from the door and further into the alley. She followed it slowly. Each step revealed another fragment, some larger, some barely visible. They didn't form a straight line, more like a path that had been taken without much care for what was left behind. Halfway down the alley, the trail became less distinct, but near the end, just before the alley opened onto the street, there was something else. A metal container sat slightly apart from the others. Its lid wasn't fully closed. She approached it. The smell reached her before she touched it. Faint, familiar. She lifted the lid just enough to look inside. The contents were mostly ordinary: bags, paper, discarded items layered on top of each other. But near the surface, partially hidden beneath a torn piece of cardboard, there was a section of fabric. Dark, heavier than the scarf. She reached in carefully and pulled it free. It was a sleeve, not from the coat she had seen downstairs. This one was different, thinner, lighter. The edge had been cut cleanly, not torn. Along the seam, the same gray residue traced a narrow line. She held it there for a moment, the alley quiet around her. Then, from the street beyond, she heard the low sound of an engine idling. Not close, but near enough to notice. The sound of the engine stayed steady, a low, continuous presence beyond the mouth of the alley. Not loud enough to draw attention on its own, but constant enough that it didn't blend into the background. She lowered the lid of the container slowly. The metal made a soft contact as it settled back into place. The sleeve remained in her hand, lighter than it looked. The cut edge was clean, almost precise, with no loose threads curling away from it. It didn't feel like something that had been damaged. It felt like something that had been altered. She stepped out of the alley. The street opened up quietly in front of her, lit by spaced-out lamps that cast long, pale reflections across the pavement. A car sat along the curb a short distance away, its headlights off, engine still running. No one visible inside at first. She paused near the edge of the sidewalk, the fabric in her hand shifting slightly as a faint breeze passed through. The air here didn't carry the same scent. It felt clearer, detached from whatever had settled inside the building. The car's engine lowered in pitch briefly, then returned to its idle. As she moved closer, the outline of someone inside became clearer. A figure in the driver's seat, one hand resting near the steering wheel, the other not visible. The window was partially down, just enough to create a narrow opening. She didn't approach directly. Instead, she walked past the car at a normal pace, her eyes drifting over it without stopping. The paint was dull in places, as if it hadn't been cleaned recently. A thin layer of dust had gathered along the edges near the windows. As she passed the rear door, she noticed something on the inside of the glass. A faint mark, not quite a handprint. More like the impression of fingers pressed lightly against the surface from within. The pattern was uneven, as though it had been left absent-mindedly rather than deliberately. She slowed slightly, just enough to take it in. Inside, the driver shifted. A small movement. The turn of a head, barely perceptible. She kept walking. At the corner, she turned without looking back. The street ahead stretched out, quieter than the one she had left. Fewer cars, fewer lights. A narrow convenience store sat across the road, its interior lit in a steady, artificial brightness that spilled onto the sidewalk. She crossed toward it. The bell above the door gave a soft, dull ring as she stepped inside. The air carried a mix of stale coffee and something sweet, like packaged pastries left too long on a shelf. A small refrigerator unit hummed near the back wall, its glass doors fogged slightly at the edges. Behind the counter, a man stood flipping through a thin stack of receipts. He glanced up briefly when she entered, then returned to what he was doing. She moved down one of the aisles slowly. The shelves were half filled, some items pushed back unevenly, leaving gaps in the front rows. A few cans sat slightly tilted, as though they had been replaced without much attention. Near the end of the aisle, a narrow mirror had been fixed to one of the support columns. It reflected a small portion of the store, the counter, the door, the dim outline of the street outside. She paused there. In the reflection, she could see the car, still idling, still in the same position. She shifted slightly, adjusting her angle. From here, the driver's silhouette was partially visible through the windshield. Still, unmoving, her gaze dropped briefly to her hand. The sleeve she held looked out of place in the bright, artificial light. The gray residue along the seam stood out more clearly now, a dull line that didn't match the rest of the fabric. She folded it once, then again, smaller, more contained, and slipped it into her bag. At the counter, the man set his receipts aside. "You need something?" he asked, not unkindly. She stepped closer, resting her hand lightly against the edge of the counter. "Have you seen anyone come through here late?" she asked. "Maybe carrying something unusual." He considered it for a moment. "People come and go," he said. "Hard to keep track." She nodded slightly. "Anyone from the building across the street?" He glanced toward the window, then back at her. "Maybe," he said. "There was someone earlier. Late. Didn't stay long." "What time?" He shrugged. "After midnight. Before 3. A pause. "Bought water." "Just water." He nodded. Didn't say much. She hesitated, then asked, "Man or woman?" He leaned back slightly, thinking. "Couldn't tell right away," he said. "Had something over their head. Hood or something like that." He gestured loosely. Voice was quiet. Her fingers rested lightly against the counter. "Did they leave on foot?" Another small pause. "No," he said. "They walked out, but—" He glanced again toward the window. There was a car. Same one, I think. She followed his gaze. The car was still there, the engine still running. Did you see the driver? Not clearly. She nodded once. Thank you. He gave a small, indifferent shrug and returned to his receipts. She stepped back from the counter and moved toward the door again. The bell rang softly as she pushed it open. Outside, the air felt cooler now. The car remained where it had been, unchanged. For a moment, she stood still, watching it. Then, without approaching, she crossed the street and continued past it, moving in the opposite direction. The sound of the engine followed her for a few seconds, then faded as she moved further away. At the end of the block, she turned again. Another building stood there, similar in structure but quieter, its entrance partially recessed from the street. A small bulletin board was mounted beside the door, covered in layered notices, some new, some curling at the edges. She stepped closer. Most of the papers were ordinary, lost items, maintenance announcements, faded advertisements. But one, near the center, caught her attention. It had been placed recently. The edges were still flat, the ink dark. A simple notice. No image. Just a short line of text. Storage units to be cleared. Unclaimed items will be removed. No date was listed. No signature. Just a small symbol in the corner, faint and easy to overlook. A simple shape, printed lightly. She leaned in. It looked familiar, not because she had seen it clearly before, but because it echoed something. Something subtle, repeated in small ways she hadn't fully noticed. Her hand moved to her pocket. The key. She took it out and held it up slightly. On the bow, barely visible in the dim light, was a small marking. The same shape. Faint, almost worn away. She lowered her hand slowly. Behind her, somewhere back down the street, the low sound of an engine shifted, then stopped. She stood there for a moment longer, the key resting against her palm, the faint symbol catching what little light reached the entryway. The paper on the board shifted slightly in a passing draft. No one else was around. She slid the key back into her pocket and reached for the door. The handle was cool, worn smooth in places where it had been used often. When she pushed it open, the hinges gave a soft, reluctant sound. Inside, the air felt still, not unused, just undisturbed. A narrow hallway stretched ahead, lined with mailboxes along one wall. Some were closed, others slightly ajar, thin envelopes visible inside. A faint scent of paper and dust lingered, mixed with something sharper she couldn't immediately place. She stepped in and let the door close behind her. The sound of the street faded quickly. A small desk sat near the far end of the hallway, unoccupied. A lamp rested on it, switched off, its cord trailing down toward an outlet that had come loose from the wall just enough to tilt slightly. She moved past the mailboxes slowly. On one of them, the same small symbol appeared again, this time scratched lightly into the metal near the keyhole. It was subtle, easy to miss unless you were looking for it. Not part of the design. Something added afterward. She traced it briefly with her fingertip, then pulled her hand away. At the end of the hallway, a second door led further inside. It wasn't locked. Beyond it, the building opened into a wider corridor, dimly lit by ceiling fixtures spaced too far apart. The floor here was concrete, smoother than the basement she had seen earlier, but still uneven in places. To her right, a stairwell. To her left, another passage leading deeper. She chose the left. The corridor narrowed as she walked, the walls closing in slightly. Pipes ran along the ceiling, some wrapped in insulation that had frayed at the edges. The air felt cooler here, and with it, that faint scent returned. Not strong, just present. Ahead, a door stood open. Light spilled from inside, soft and yellow, unlike the harsher tones of the hallway. She approached it slowly and looked in. It was a small room, barely larger than a storage space, but arranged with more care than the others she had seen. Shelves lined the walls, holding boxes, folded cloths, and a few items placed with deliberate spacing between them. In the center, a table. On it, several objects lay in quiet order. A pair of gloves, a glass bottle empty, a stack of papers aligned neatly. She stepped inside. The air here carried the scent more clearly, not overwhelming, but layered, as if it had settled over time rather than arriving all at once. She moved toward the table. The gloves were thin, made of a material that caught the light in a dull sheen. One lay flat. The other was turned slightly, as if it had been set down without much attention. She didn't touch them. The bottle beside them had no label. Its surface was clean, except for a faint smudge near the neck. She leaned in slightly. There was no liquid inside, but along the bottom, a thin residue had collected. Gray. Her gaze shifted to the papers. They weren't documents in any formal sense. Just sheets, some blank, others marked with small notes. Not sentences, not lists, just short lines. Symbols. Repeated shapes. The same shape. Over and over, drawn in different sizes, some darker than others, as if traced multiple times. She lifted one of the sheets. The paper felt slightly rougher than expected, as though it had absorbed something over time. The ink hadn't bled, but it had settled unevenly in places. She set it back down. On the far wall, near the shelves, something else caught her attention. A hook, similar to the one in the storage unit she had seen earlier. But this one held nothing. The space beneath it, however, was marked. A faint outline against the wall where something had once hung for a long time, shielding that section from dust and discoloration. She stepped closer. The outline was narrow, vertical, roughly the length of a coat sleeve. She reached out, hovering her hand near the wall without touching it. The scent lingered more strongly here. Behind her, the hallway remained silent. She turned back toward the table. The arrangement of the items hadn't changed, but now, standing in the room longer, she noticed something subtle. They weren't just placed neatly. They were spaced, each object positioned with a small gap between it and the next, as if the empty space itself mattered. Her eyes moved across them slowly. Gloves, bottle, papers, and then, at the edge of the table, something she hadn't seen at first. A small metal tray. Inside it, a few fragments lay scattered. Gray, uneven, some larger, some reduced almost to powder. She stepped closer. The fragments looked similar to what she had seen in the alley, near the doorway in the stairwell. She reached into her bag and took out the folded piece of fabric she had collected earlier. Unfolding it carefully, she held it near the tray. The residue along its seam matched in tone, in texture. Not identical, but close enough that it didn't feel like coincidence. She placed the fabric back into her bag. From somewhere above, faint and distant, a sound traveled through the building. Not footsteps, something lighter. A door opening, then closing again. She stood still, listening. The sound didn't repeat. The room settled back into quiet. She stepped away from the table and moved toward the shelves. Most of the boxes were closed, their surfaces unmarked. A few had been labeled, but the writing had faded to the point of being unreadable. One, near the bottom, sat slightly out of alignment with the others. She crouched and pulled it forward. It wasn't heavy. When she lifted the lid, the smell rose slightly, though not as strong as before. Inside, several items had been placed carefully. A folded scarf, another beneath it, different colors, different patterns, none of them gray. She touched the top one lightly. The fabric was soft, well kept, not like the one she held. She closed the lid and slid the box back into place. When she stood, her eyes moved once more around the room, taking in the arrangement, the spacing, the quiet order of everything. Nothing appeared rushed, nothing out of place, and yet nothing felt incidental. She stepped back into the hallway. The door remained open behind her. As she moved away, the light from the room stretched out briefly along the floor, then narrowed as the angle shifted. At the end of the corridor, near where it met the main hallway, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. A small, rectangular panel set into the wall, slightly ajar. She approached it slowly. The edges were worn, the paint chipped around the corners. When she pulled it open further, it revealed a shallow compartment. Inside, a set of keys hung from a hook. Several of them, different shapes, different sizes, some older, some newer, each one marked, not with numbers, but with that same small symbol. She reached out and selected one at random. It was similar in weight to the one in her pocket, but not identical. Turning it in her fingers, she noticed the same faint gray residue along its edge. She placed it back, closed the panel, and stood there for a moment, her hand resting lightly against the wall. Somewhere deeper in the building, a faint sound echoed again, this time closer. Not a door, a movement, brief, then stillness. She turned her head slightly, listening. The corridor ahead remained empty, but the air felt different now, not heavier, just aware. She stayed where she was, her hand still resting against the wall, feeling the faint unevenness beneath the paint. The sensation grounded her for a moment, something physical and unchanged. The sound didn't repeat, but the silence that followed it felt less empty than before. She stepped forward, slowly, letting her pace match the stillness around her. The corridor ahead bent slightly to the right, narrowing just enough to obscure what lay beyond it. The light there was dimmer, one of the ceiling fixtures flickering at irregular intervals. As she rounded the corner, the source of the earlier movement revealed itself, though only partially. A door, further down, stood just barely open, not wide enough to see inside clearly, just a thin line of darkness framed by the dim hallway light. She approached without rushing. The floor here was smoother, recently cleaned, or perhaps just less used. Her footsteps made almost no sound. The air carried a faint dryness, the same subtle trace she had followed from the beginning, though thinner now, like something dissipating. She stopped just short of the door. The gap was narrow. No light came through from inside. She reached out and pushed it gently. The hinges moved without resistance. Inside, the room was darker than the others. No overhead light, only a faint glow from a small window near the ceiling, letting in a muted, distant light from outside. It took a moment for her eyes to adjust. The space was longer than it was wide, with a low ceiling that made it feel slightly compressed. Along one wall, a row of narrow lockers stood, their metal surfaces dull and marked with age. Some doors were closed. Others hung slightly open, revealing shadows within. She stepped inside. The air felt cooler here and quieter. Even the distant sounds of the building seemed to stop at the threshold. Her attention moved to the lockers. Each one had a small slot near the top, and beneath it, a keyhole. Several of them bore faint scratches near the lock, as if keys had been inserted often, not always smoothly. She moved to the nearest open one. Inside, it was empty. No shelves, no items left behind. Just the bare metal interior, faintly discolored in places where something had once rested for a long time. She moved to the next. Closed. She touched the handle lightly. It didn't open. Her hand drifted to her pocket. The key. She hesitated, then took it out. Holding it up near the lock, she compared the shape. It didn't match perfectly, but it didn't feel entirely wrong either. Close enough to consider. She didn't try it. Instead, she moved further down the row. At the far end, one locker stood slightly different from the others. Its surface was cleaner. Not new, but less worn. The edges sharper, the handle less dulled. It was closed. She stood in front of it for a moment, then reached out. The handle turned easily. The door opened with a soft, controlled movement. Inside, something had been left behind. A bag. Simple, dark, made of a material that held its shape even when empty. She leaned in slightly. It wasn't empty. She reached in and lifted it out, placing it gently on the floor. The zipper ran along the top, partially open. She widened it just enough to look inside. Fabric. Folded. Layered. Not clothes in the usual sense. More like pieces. Sections. Different textures. Different weights. Some lighter, like the sleeve she had found. Others heavier. Each one carried that same faint trace. She didn't touch them further. Instead, her attention shifted to the inside of the locker itself. The back wall bore marks. Not scratches. Impressions. Faint, vertical lines where something had pressed repeatedly against the surface. Not deep, but consistent. She ran her fingers lightly over them. The metal felt slightly rough there, as if worn down over time. She stepped back. The room remained still. Behind her, the door she had entered through stayed open, the thin line of hallway light stretching across the floor toward her feet. She glanced at it briefly, then back to the locker. Something else caught her eye. At the bottom corner, near the hinge, a small fragment rested. Gray. She crouched and picked it up. It crumbled slightly under the pressure of her fingers, leaving a faint residue behind. She rubbed it gently. The texture matched everything she had seen before. She stood again. The bag remained open at her feet, the contents undisturbed. For a moment, she considered closing it, returning it to the locker, leaving the room as she had found it. But instead, she stepped away, back toward the door. As she reached the threshold, she paused. From the hallway beyond, a sound reached her. Not movement. A voice. Low. Indistinct. Just beyond the range of clear words. She leaned slightly toward the opening, listening. Another voice responded. Quieter. The conversation was brief. Not hurried, but not lingering either. Just enough to suggest presence. She stepped back into the shadow of the room, her body aligning with the darker section of the wall, out of direct view from the hallway. The voices passed. Footsteps followed. Slow. Measured. They moved along the corridor, not stopping at the door, not checking the room, just continuing past. After a few seconds, the sound faded. She remained still a moment longer, then stepped out. The hallway looked unchanged. Empty. The flickering light continued its uneven rhythm. She moved back the way she had come, her pace steady, her movements quiet. As she passed the panel with the keys, she slowed again. This time, she opened it once more. The keys hung in the same arrangement. But one space was empty, a small gap where something had been. She closed the panel slowly and continued down the corridor. When she reached the main hallway, the air shifted again, becoming lighter, more familiar. She walked toward the exit. As she passed the mailboxes, her eyes moved across them without stopping, until one caught her attention. A small piece of paper had been tucked into the edge of one of the slots, barely visible. She reached for it and pulled it free. It was thin, folded once. When she opened it, there was no message, no words, just the same small symbol drawn in the center, darker than before, more deliberate. She turned it over. On the back, a faint smudge. Gray. She folded it again and slipped it into her pocket. The door to the street opened easily. Outside, the air felt different again, cooler, clearer. The street was quieter now. The car was gone. No sign it had been there at all. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking down the length of the road. The lights remained steady. Nothing moved. But near the curb, not far from where the car had been, something small caught the light. She stepped closer. A key, lying flat against the pavement. She picked it up, turned it in her fingers. The same shape, the same faint marking. But along its edge, the gray residue was thicker, less disturbed, as if it hadn't been handled since it was last used. She held it there for a moment, then slipped it into her pocket beside the other, and began walking. The street stretched ahead without interruption, the buildings on either side spaced just far enough apart to let the night settle between them. Her steps fell into a steady rhythm, unhurried, matching the quiet around her. The keys in her pocket shifted slightly as she walked. After a block, the ground changed beneath her feet. The smooth pavement gave way to a narrower path that cut between two older buildings, less maintained, the edges lined with low concrete barriers worn down at the corners. A faint light flickered further in. She followed it. The passage opened into a small courtyard, enclosed on all sides. The walls were uneven, patched in places where repairs had been made without much care for appearance. A single overhead lamp hung from a wire stretched between two buildings, its light weak but steady. Near the center, a bench sat angled slightly away from the wall. Someone had been there recently, not because of anything obvious. No items left behind, no visible disturbance. But the surface of the bench held a slight warmth when she placed her hand against it, lingering just enough to notice. She sat. The quiet here felt different, more contained. The sounds of the street didn't carry in fully, leaving only distant fragments that didn't quite connect. Her hand slipped into her pocket again, feeling the keys. She took them out. Two now. Similar, but not identical. She turned them over slowly in her palm. Both carried the same faint symbol, worn into the metal. One had deeper residue along its edge, darker, more settled. The other lighter, as if it had been handled more recently. She pressed them together lightly. They made a soft, dull contact. Her gaze lifted. Across the courtyard, a door sat partially recessed into the wall. It didn't look like a main entrance. No markings, no signage. Just a plain surface with a narrow window set high, too small to see through clearly. She stood and moved toward it. The handle turned without resistance. Inside, a short corridor led down a shallow set of steps. The air changed immediately. Cooler, still, carrying a faint dryness that felt familiar. She descended. At the bottom, the corridor opened into a long, low room. Not quite a basement. Not quite a storage area. Something in between. Along one wall, shelves had been installed, but many of them stood empty. A few held scattered items, boxes, folded materials, small containers with lids that had been placed carefully but not labeled. The opposite wall was bare, except for a series of hooks, each one spaced evenly apart. Some held items, others did not. She moved closer. On one hook, a scarf hung loosely, its fabric darker than the one she carried. The edges were clean, the material heavier. She reached out and touched it lightly. No scent, or if there was, it had faded. On the next hook, a coat. Not the one she had seen earlier, but similar in weight. The sleeve hung slightly lower than the other, just enough to suggest it hadn't been adjusted when placed there. She didn't touch it. Instead, she moved along the row. Several hooks remained empty, but beneath them, the wall showed faint outlines where items had once hung. Different shapes, different lengths, a pattern without clear order. At the far end of the room, a table stood alone. She approached it slowly. The surface was bare, except for a single object placed near the center. A small notebook. She picked it up. The cover was plain, slightly worn at the edges. When she opened it, the pages inside revealed the same kind of markings she had seen before. Not words, not sentences, just symbols, repeated, some drawn with more pressure, others barely visible. On a few pages, the symbols had been layered over each other, creating darker sections where the ink had gathered. She turned another page. This one was different. A faint outline had been sketched, simple, minimal, but recognizable. A rectangular shape, divided into smaller sections, like a set of lockers. She paused, then turned the page again. More symbols. She closed the notebook and set it back down. Behind her, something shifted. A small sound. She turned. The room remained still. But near the entrance, the door she had come through stood slightly more open than before. She was certain she hadn't left it that way. She watched it for a moment. Nothing moved. The light from the corridor stretched across the floor, reaching just short of her feet. She stepped toward it. Each movement felt deliberate now, the quiet around her pressing in slightly closer. When she reached the doorway, she paused again and glanced back. The hooks, the table, the notebook, all unchanged. She stepped into the corridor. The air felt different here again, less contained, carrying a faint trace of the outside. As she moved up the steps, her hand brushed against the wall. Rough, cool. At the top, she pushed the door open wider and stepped back into the courtyard. The bench remained empty. The overhead lamp flickered once, then steadied. She crossed the space slowly, her attention drifting toward the ground near the base of the walls. There, faint and scattered, were the same gray fragments she had been following. Not in a straight line, not even in a clear path, just present. She crouched and picked one up. It crumbled easily, leaving the now familiar residue on her fingertips. She wiped it against the fabric of her sleeve. When she stood again, she noticed something else. Near the edge of the courtyard, partially hidden by shadow, another door. Smaller, lower, set closer to the ground. She hadn't seen it when she entered. She approached it. The handle was colder than the others. When she turned it, there was resistance. Then it gave. Inside, the space was tighter, more confined. A narrow passage that angled slightly downward. The air here was heavier, the scent stronger, not overwhelming, but unmistakable. She stepped inside. The passage led to a small room, barely large enough to stand in comfortably. No shelves, no hooks, just a single object placed on the floor. A container, metal, closed. She knelt beside it. The surface was cool beneath her fingers. Along the edges, faint traces of the gray residue had settled, collecting in the seams. She lifted the lid slowly. Inside, the contents were arranged with the same quiet precision she had seen elsewhere. Folded pieces of fabric, smaller this time, more uniform, each one carrying that same faint, dry trace. She reached out and touched one. The texture felt different, thinner, more delicate. She withdrew her hand. For a moment, she remained there, looking down into the container. Then, from somewhere beyond the courtyard, faint but clear, a door closed. Not in this building. Close enough to hear. She lowered the lid, stood, and listened. The sound didn't repeat, but the stillness that followed felt more complete than before, as if something had just ended, or begun. She stood for a while in the small room, her hand resting lightly on the closed lid of the container. as if feeling for something through the metal. The air had gone still again, the earlier sound already fading into something uncertain, like it might have come from further away than it had. When she stepped back into the courtyard, the overhead lamp held steady. The bench was unchanged. The faint traces along the ground caught the light differently now, softer, less distinct. She didn't return the way she had come. Instead, she moved along the edge of the courtyard, following the wall where the fragments were scattered more thinly. They didn't lead anywhere clearly, but they didn't disappear either. They lingered, as if marking presence rather than direction. At the far corner, a narrow passage opened between two walls, barely wide enough to walk through without turning slightly. The ground here was smoother, less disturbed. The gray traces faded, replaced by ordinary dust and small debris. She followed it out. The passage led to a quieter street, narrower than the others, lined with older buildings that leaned slightly toward each other. Most of the windows were dark. A few held dim lights behind curtains drawn tightly. She walked without thinking too much about where she was going. After some time, she recognized the block. The building she had started from stood ahead, unchanged. The same faint glow from the open apartment still spilled into the hallway beyond the entrance. She slowed as she approached. Inside, the air felt familiar now, not because it had changed, but because she had. The hallway held the same quiet stillness. Mrs. Ilyena's door remained closed. No movement from behind it. She crossed to the apartment. The door still stood half open. She stepped in again. The lamp near the window continued to cast its soft circle of light. The glass of water on the counter hadn't moved. The second glass remained where she had left it. The chair held its slight angle. Nothing had been disturbed. And yet, the space felt different. Not emptier, just finished. She closed the door gently behind her this time. The soft click settled into the room. She moved through the apartment slowly, retracing what she had already seen. The bedroom, the book, the small dish with its contents. Everything in place. She stood near the window, looking out at the street below. The spot where the car had been was now just another section of curb, indistinguishable from the rest. Her hand moved to the scarf. She lifted it again, bringing it closer. The scent was still there, but now, it didn't feel like something separate. It felt like a remainder, a trace of something that had already passed. She lowered it. Her gaze drifted back toward the entrance. The indentation in the carpet near the threshold remained faintly visible. This time, she stepped closer and crouched, looking at it without touching it. The shape wasn't random. It matched the curve of the scarf when folded just so, placed deliberately. Not dropped, not forgotten. She stood again, and then, without urgency, she began to move through the apartment differently. Not searching, reconsidering. At the kitchen counter, she picked up the first glass, the one filled with water. It was untouched. Beside it, the empty one, used more recently. She set them side by side. Two presences, not simultaneous, but close enough. At the table, she straightened the chair slightly, aligning it with the others. The crease in the cushion shifted, but didn't disappear. She let her hand rest there for a moment, feeling the faint impression beneath the fabric. Someone had sat. Not long, just long enough. She moved back toward the entrance, the scarf still in her hand. She looked at the doorknob, at the place where it had been left. Then, slowly, she lifted the scarf and placed it there again. Not exactly as before, but close. The fabric settled into place, the weight of it pulling one end slightly lower. She stepped back, the scene aligned, not as it had been, but as it had been intended to be seen. Her hand slipped into her pocket, touching the keys. She took them out again. 2 keys. Same symbol. Same quiet marking. She turned them over in her hand, then looked toward the door, the hallway beyond, the stairwell, the basement, the room she had walked through, the lockers, the hooks, the containers, everything arranged, not for use, for process, for transition. The thought didn't come all at once. It settled, gradually, like the residue itself. The scarves, the coats, the pieces, none of them random, none of them abandoned. They had been placed, moved, reduced, not hidden, but transformed into something less noticeable, less immediate. The gray traces weren't just byproducts. They were what remained after something had been handled repeatedly, altered in small, controlled ways, broken down until it no longer held its original form. She looked at the scarf again, whole, untouched, except for the faint scent, left behind, not as evidence, but as a signal, a final marker. She stepped into the hallway, closed the apartment door fully this time. The latch clicked into place. The sound echoed softly. She stood there for a moment, then turned and walked toward the stairwell. Down again. The air shifted as she descended. The scent returned, but softer now. Familiar. In the basement, the laundry room remained unchanged. The chair, the shelf, the sink with its thin layer of water. She crossed it without stopping, into the corridor, to the storage unit she had seen earlier. The coat still hung where it had been. She stepped inside and reached for it. This time, she lifted it fully from the hook. It was lighter than it should have been. Not empty, but not complete. She held it for a moment, then folded it carefully and placed it back inside the room, not on the hook, but on the floor, near the wall. Something about it felt finished. She stepped back out and closed the door. Further down, the locker room. She entered it again. The open locker still held the bag. She approached it slowly, then reached in and zipped it closed. The sound was soft, final. She returned it to the locker and shut the door. This time, it stayed closed. She didn't try the key. She didn't need to. When she stepped back into the hallway, the panel with the keys remained slightly ajar. She opened it once more. The missing space remained. She looked at the keys that were still there. Then, quietly, she placed one of hers onto the empty hook, the one with the deeper residue. It settled into place without a sound. She closed the panel and walked away, up the stairs, into the hallway, past the apartment, out through the building entrance. The night air felt cooler now, cleaner. The street remained quiet. Nothing moved. She walked without looking back. After a while, the building disappeared behind her, blending into the line of others. The keys in her pocket were lighter now. Just one, the remaining one. She didn't take it out again. By the time she reached the next intersection, the faint scent that had followed her all this time had faded completely. There was only the ordinary air and the quiet. She paused briefly under a street lamp, then continued on, her steps steady, the night settling around her without resistance. Case 2. A patient in ICU was scheduled for a sedative drip. When the nurse examined the line, it contained only saline. The digital chart insisted the medication had been infused continuously, while video footage later revealed no personnel handling the drip. The ICU was quiet, though not silent. The soft click of a monitor registering a heartbeat echoed faintly against walls that smelled faintly of disinfectant and warmed plastic. Outside, rain slid down the window panes, smudging the view of the empty parking lot, blurring the world beyond into gray streaks. The patient's room smelled of antiseptic and the faint metallic tang of the oxygen tubing. The ventilator's gentle rhythm filled the background, a mechanical mimicry of calm breaths. Nurse Callahan traced her finger along the 4 line again, hesitating at the junction where the medication should have joined the saline. Her nails tapped softly against the plastic casing. The line was still clear, almost impossibly so, and the drip chamber contained nothing but colorless fluid. The thought was fleeting, as if merely acknowledging it might make it real. She glanced at the chart on the screen. The sedative was supposedly running continuously. The discrepancy felt heavy in the quiet room. Across the hall, a housekeeping cart squeaked against the floor, the sound scraping through the near-empty corridors. Callahan's shoes made soft thumps on the linoleum as she walked toward the nurse's station, the sleeves of her scrubs brushing against her wrists. She leaned over the keyboard and pulled up the digital records again, eyes scanning timestamps, infusion logs, and system alerts. Nothing seemed amiss according to the interface. Every entry was neat, every box ticked, every timestamp unbroken. She picked up a pen and flipped to her notes. The handwriting was small and tight, pressed carefully to avoid smudging in the humid room. She wrote the time of the last check, then paused, noticing the subtle discoloration at the base of the foreline. A faint ring of dried residue, almost unnoticed, clung where the bag connected to the tubing. She sniffed lightly, the scent faint, medicinal, almost imperceptible, yet different from the saline she had used in preparation. Later, in the break room, the smell of burnt coffee lingered in the air, sharp and dark against the faint antiseptic that seeped in from the hallway. A colleague, Thompson, stirred sugar into his cup with slow, careful motions. He didn't look up when Callahan slid into the chair across from him. The room smelled of paper cups, cleaning solution, and the faint must of worn linoleum. "I checked the line," she said softly, tapping her notebook. "It's saline. The chart insists it's been infused." Thompson blinked slowly, his spoon pausing midair. "You're saying the patient didn't get the sedative?" Callahan shook her head, watching the tiny whirlpool the sugar made in the coffee. According to the video, no one touched the bag either. Not once. A pause. The hum of the vending machine in the corner filled the space. Rain drummed against the window, a quiet, constant rhythm. "Could be a glitch," Thompson said finally, his voice low, careful. "System error. Maybe it logged it wrong." Callahan chewed the inside of her cheek, her gaze drifting to the muted gray sky outside the window. "Maybe," she murmured. "But it's too neat. Too consistent." They didn't speak further, only the faint scratching of the pen as she returned to her notes. Each line was methodical, recording times, observations, and lingering thoughts about the residue, the clarity of the saline, the sterile appearance of the line. Later, the night nurse walked past, humming quietly, her footsteps light and quick. The ICU smelled warmer now, a mix of body heat, plastic, and faint antiseptic. Callahan returned to the room, tracing the tubing again, watching the light catch the fluid inside. The drip chamber reflected the overhead lights in tiny, glimmering arcs, almost like faint stars trapped in plastic. On the counter, the empty medication vials sat in neat rows, labels facing forward. She lifted one, turning it slowly, noticing the tiny fingerprint smudge at the edge of the label. The paper felt slightly rough under her fingertips. She didn't know if it mattered yet, but she put it back carefully. Outside, the rain softened, turning into a whispering drizzle. Somewhere down the hall, a chair scraped against the floor. The air smelled faintly of coffee and antiseptic, a strange comfort in the quiet tension. Callahan closed her eyes briefly, listening to the subtle shifts, the hiss of the ventilator, the occasional beep of a monitor, the drip of water somewhere in the pipes. She opened her eyes and looked at the 4-bag again. Still saline, still untouched, still recording a truth that no one had seen. And somewhere, just beyond the reach of her awareness, a small irregularity waited, silent, patient, and unassuming, ready to emerge. Callahan left the ICU and moved down the side corridor, her steps muted against the worn linoleum. The night was settling deeper, the hall lights casting narrow pools of yellow over the floor, leaving long shadows where the walls met the ground. She paused at a supply closet, listening to the quiet. The faint hum of a refrigeration unit somewhere beyond a doorway thrummed softly, a steady, low vibration that seemed almost alive in the silence. Inside the closet, shelves held neatly stacked boxes of gloves, syringes, and tubing. She ran a finger along the edge of a cardboard box, feeling a faint ridge, a tiny tear in the corner, almost imperceptible. A paper label hung slightly off-center. She leaned closer, noticing a smudge of what might have been ink, or perhaps dried medication, along the seam. Nothing dramatic, only a whisper of irregularity. She pulled a small notebook from her pocket and jotted the time and location. The pen made a soft scratching noise, the sound amplified in the narrow space. When she straightened, she noticed the faint smell of something chemical, almost sweet, lingering near the back of the closet. She inhaled lightly, but it faded before she could place it. Exiting the closet, she walked toward the staff lounge. The hallway smelled faintly of rain from outside, damp concrete and asphalt mixing with the sterile scent of the hospital. The lounge was empty. Chairs were pushed under tables, and a faint streak of condensation ran down the window, catching the glow of the streetlights outside. Callahan sat at one of the tables, tracing the edge with her fingers. She noticed a half-empty thermos on the counter, the lid loosened, leaving a faint ring on the laminate. She touched the ring lightly, then drew her hand back, noticing a fine streak of residue on the surface, almost imperceptible unless you were paying attention. It was faintly metallic, and it seemed slightly out of place among the mundane cups and snack wrappers. A soft knock at the door startled her. Thompson peeked in, holding a small tray of tea. "Couldn't sleep," he murmured, placing it carefully on the table. The steam rose in gentle spirals, carrying the scent of chamomile. "Figured you might need a break." Callahan nodded, staring at the tea. "I found something in the supply closet," she said. "Tiny tear, smudge of something. Could be nothing." Thompson set the tray down and leaned against the counter. "Could be everything," he said quietly. His gaze drifted toward the window, where rain had slowed to a fine drizzle, streaks sliding down the glass. "Nothing in this place is ever simple, is it?" They didn't speak further. Instead, they traced small routines, the shifting of chairs, the faint smell of cleaning solution, the gentle creak of a ceiling vent above. Each sound and scent carried its own quiet weight, as if the building itself remembered things that no one did. Later, Callahan wandered into the hospital's maintenance corridors, narrow and dimly lit, with exposed pipes and wires coiling along the ceiling. The air was cooler here, slightly damp, smelling of concrete and old paint. A cart leaned against the wall, wheels squeaking faintly when she nudged it. She noticed a tiny scuff on the floor, a faint mark not on any of the maps she had studied, a pattern of movement she couldn't yet explain. At a junction, she noticed a small door ajar, one she didn't remember seeing before. It led to a narrow storage room filled with stacked linen carts. The faint scent of bleach mixed with the damp, giving the air a biting edge. One cart had a sheet draped over it that looked slightly shifted, as if it had been moved recently. Underneath, she noticed the corner of a small, folded sheet of paper peeking out. She reached down carefully, her fingertips brushing the surface. The paper was blank at first glance, but when she held it under the fluorescent light, faint indentations appeared, tiny lines pressed into the surface, writing that had been transferred from another sheet, nearly invisible, as if someone had tried to erase it. She set it aside in her notebook, recording time and location, careful not to disturb anything else. The hum of the building seemed to deepen as she moved back toward the main corridor, each footstep echoing differently on the worn tiles. Somewhere far away, a door clicked shut. Somewhere else, a radiator hissed faintly, the warmth pressing against the cool night air creeping in through the windows. Callahan paused by the nurse's station again, leaning over the counter. She traced the edge of the keyboard, noticing a faint smudge of grease or ink near the enter key, something not from her own fingers. She pressed the keys lightly, the sound muted, and glanced up at the blank monitors reflecting her own expression back at her. Each reflection, each small imperfection, seemed to whisper that something invisible had passed through, leaving nothing but traces. Outside, the rain had slowed to a whisper, the lights of the parking lot casting long, wet shadows across the asphalt. She looked at her notebook again, noting each minor clue, the tear, the residue, the indentations. None of it explained the line in the patient's room. None of it answered the question. But each small detail pressed forward, quiet, deliberate, a breadcrumb trail that seemed to hum just beneath the surface of ordinary hospital life. And somewhere, in the quiet spaces of halls and rooms no one noticed, the truth waited, silent, patient, and slow to reveal itself. Callahan returned to the ICU hallways just as a faint gray dawn began to leak through the high windows. The rain had stopped, leaving the linoleum slick in places and the air carrying a faint chill. She pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders, the fabric catching the subtle scent of the hospital. Warmed antiseptic, faint traces of lotion from night staff, and something almost like metal in the air. She moved toward the records room, a narrow space lined with tall, gray filing cabinets. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, rhythmically, but dimmed at the far corner where the cabinets formed a shadowed alcove. She ran her fingers along the cabinet handles, noting the cool metal under her fingertips, the slight stick of dust in the grooves. One drawer was slightly misaligned, a hair's width off from the others. She pressed it lightly, and it gave with a soft, reluctant click. Inside, files were stacked neatly, but as she shuffled through, a thin paper slipped out. It was a delivery slip, not signed or stamped, listing a small order of saline bags. But one line had been crossed out with faint pencil marks and another line written over it, almost illegible. She held it under the light, tracing the faint indentations with her finger. The pencil marks weren't messy, careful, deliberate, almost deliberate enough to suggest someone wanted to obscure a detail. The air in the records room was warmer here, trapped between walls and file cabinets, and smelled faintly of old paper and dust. Callahan set the slip into her notebook, noting the time and the drawer location. The quiet clicking of a distant cart echoed softly down the hall, and somewhere, a door squeaked open. Later, she wandered into the hospital chapel, a small, wood-paneled room tucked between the main corridors. Morning light filtered through a narrow, stained glass window, painting muted reds and blues across the polished floor. The scent of waxed wood mixed with faint incense, and she noticed a chair slightly out of line with the others. Its legs had faint scratches on the floor beneath it, almost like it had been shifted and replaced quickly. She crouched to inspect, brushing her fingers along the scratches. They were shallow, subtle, but consistent, almost rhythmic. A small kneeling bench against the wall caught her eye. The velvet cushion was slightly compressed in one corner, the fabric showing faint white fibers caught along the seam. She leaned closer, pressing lightly. Underneath, a tiny slip of paper had fallen and curled at the edges. It was blank except for a few faint indentations that she could feel more than see, small marks that suggested writing, erased or transferred. She tucked it into her notebook with care. Callahan left the chapel, moving toward the hospital's cafeteria. The automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh, carrying the faint smell of day-old coffee, cleaning solution, and the damp traces of morning air from outside. A janitor pushed a mop bucket slowly along the tiles, the wheels squeaking in irregular intervals, a pattern she half-traced with her eyes. At the counter, she noticed a stack of paper trays, each labeled for different wards. One tray was slightly offset from the others, and the top sheet had a corner folded under. She lifted it carefully, a small chart noting inventory counts, but the numbers in the for supplies column had been overwritten multiple times in neat, almost imperceptible script. The pencil marks pressed faintly into the paper, like whispers of changes someone didn't want noticed. Thompson appeared then, leaning against the opposite counter, cup of coffee in hand. He nodded at her silently, eyes scanning the cafeteria with a cautious sweep. "Morning," he said softly. "Any new oddities?" Callahan showed him the tray and the chart. "It's small, almost nothing, but it's consistent. Tiny changes, careful edits. I think someone's been recording differently than they should." Thompson sipped his coffee slowly, the steam curling upward. "Could be a simple mistake," he said, but there was no conviction in his voice. He followed her gaze to the tray. "Or maybe someone wants it to look that way." She nodded, tucking the paper into her notebook. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the thin metal siding of the service entrance. Rain puddles reflected the gray sky, streaked with the shadows of passing vehicles. Inside, the cafeteria felt unusually quiet, the faint scrape of a chair leg or the drip of a leaky faucet magnified in the stillness. Later still, Callahan moved toward the hospital's rooftop garden, a small space with brick walkways and planters left over from the warmer months. The air was sharp, carrying the metallic tang of approaching spring and the faint scent of damp soil. She crouched to examine the edge of a planter, noticing a small smudge, almost like dried lotion or cream, on the brickwork. It was subtle, easy to miss unless she was looking deliberately, and yet, placed in that quiet space, it seemed deliberate. From a bench nearby, the city beyond was muted by distance and early morning haze, buildings softened in gray. She leaned back, letting her hand brush against the wooden slats, feeling tiny scratches and grooves that seemed almost like messages left unconsidered. Somewhere, far below, a door opened, faint clatter of a trolley rolling along the corridor. She closed her eyes briefly, listening to the subtle layering of sounds, the faint hum of distant ventilation, the occasional drip of water from an unseen pipe, the soft scrape of shoes on tile. Each tiny element seemed to carry weight, though she couldn't yet name it. When she opened her eyes, she spotted something tucked against the base of a planter, a thin, folded strip of paper, edges frayed. It had nothing written, yet the faint impressions pressed into it suggested a hurried hand. She slid it into her notebook, noting the location, the time, the feel of it under her fingers. And still, the mystery lingered, silent, patient, as though the hospital itself held its breath. waiting for someone to notice the patterns woven into its quiet, ordinary spaces. Each small discovery pressed forward, never shouting, never urgent, but undeniable, a lattice of traces, quietly building, one subtle clue at a time. Callahan descended the narrow service stairs that led from the rooftop garden back toward the hospital's lower levels. The stairwell smelled faintly of damp concrete, faint mold in the corners, and the faint tang of old paint. Each step echoed softly against the walls, a muted rhythm that seemed to follow her as she moved. Her hand brushed against the cold metal railing, its surface slick in some spots from condensation, rough in others where rust had begun to form. At the landing between floors, she paused, noticing a small streak of moisture running along the baseboard. The color was faint, almost the same as the tile, but in the morning light filtering from a small window above, it caught her eye. She knelt, pressing a fingertip to the streak. It was slightly sticky, metallic in scent, and not water. She lifted her hand and sniffed lightly, trying to place it. Old blood? Residue from cleaning chemicals? She couldn't tell, and that uncertainty lingered like a shadow. She continued down the stairs and emerged into the hospital's basement storage corridor, a long, narrow space lined with shelves of boxes, spare furniture, and maintenance equipment. The fluorescent lights here flickered occasionally, casting brief, wavering shadows that stretched across the concrete floor. The air smelled faintly of oil and disinfectant, mingled with the earthy scent of cardboard and dust. A small utility door stood slightly ajar at the far end. Callahan approached, the wheels of a cart squeaking softly behind her as if it had been waiting for her passage. She nudged the door open with a fingertip. Inside was a small room that smelled warmer, almost of human presence. A faint odor of hand sanitizer lingered in the air, mingled with a subtle sweetness, like the faint residue of cough syrup. On a low shelf against the wall, she noticed a set of tiny vials, lined up in precise rows. Most were empty, but one retained a small amount of liquid. The label was partially peeled, and the handwriting was minute, deliberate, almost hesitant in the slant. She turned the vial in her hand, watching the light catch the liquid inside. It seemed ordinary, but something about the care with which it had been arranged, its isolation from the rest, made her pause. She placed it back carefully, moving her gaze along the floor. Tiny scuffs led from the shelf to the corner of the room, as if something had been dragged, deliberately, then set down. The marks were uneven, faint, and easy to miss unless she was looking for them. She traced them slowly with her finger, noting their direction, the slight pressure variation where the scuffs deepened, almost like fingerprints pressed into concrete. Later, she wandered into the hospital's staff locker room, a narrow space lined with wooden lockers, each bearing the faint smell of worn fabric and deodorant. A faint buzz of the fluorescent lights above added a soft background vibration. One locker door, nearest the window, was slightly crooked. She opened it gently. Inside, folded scrubs revealed a small patch of dark residue at the corner of the pocket, nearly invisible against the blue fabric. She pressed lightly, and it left a faint streak on her fingertip. She tucked it into a small paper towel and placed it in her notebook, noting the time and locker number. She leaned back against the wall, listening to the faint creak of shoes on the tiled floor, the muted chatter of a morning shift beginning elsewhere in the hospital, and the distant hiss of a radiator. Each sound seemed exaggerated in the quiet of the room. The faint metallic tang of the residue lingered under her nails, and she wondered how it might connect, or if it was simply another quiet detail drifting through the day. Callahan's next stop was the hospital's pneumatic tube system room, a small chamber with coiled tubes and metal canisters that hissed faintly when empty. The smell here was sharp, metallic, almost electric. She noticed one canister that had been replaced recently, the metal still warm from use, fingerprints visible along the smooth surface. She touched them lightly, feeling the ridges left by someone's grip, and wondered what had been inside. The canister was empty now, but the impression of its journey remained, an invisible trace in the quiet machinery. From the corner of her eye, she caught movement through the small observation window. A shadow passed across the hallway beyond, indistinct, gliding with purpose, yet leaving no other sign. She waited, holding her breath, listening to the faint ticking of a wall clock and the soft vibrations of the ventilation system. The shadow did not return, but its fleeting presence pressed into the room, leaving her aware of unseen movements that might matter. Later, she found herself in the hospital's loading dock. The large overhead doors were closed, leaving the space dim, smelling of damp asphalt and diesel from trucks that had arrived before sunrise. A pallet stacked with boxes leaned slightly, and one corner had a faint, dark streak along the edge, smudged but deliberate, as if someone had brushed against it in a hurry. She traced the streak with a gloved hand, noting the pattern. It led not toward the door, but along the floor, vanishing under a shadow cast by the overhead lights. Callahan paused, letting the silence of the dock settle over her. The faint hiss of the vents, the distant echo of boots in the hallway above, the subtle, almost imperceptible scent of chemicals and dampness, all combined to press her awareness into the small details. Each scuff, smear, and fingerprinted surface was quiet, almost apologetic, yet it carried an insistence she could not ignore. She exhaled slowly, flipping through her notebook, arranging each subtle discovery into a chain that didn't yet have a beginning or an end. Somewhere in the ordinary quiet of the hospital, in these overlooked spaces, a pattern was forming, slow, deliberate, and invisible to anyone not paying attention. And she felt it pressing gently at the edge of her mind, patient, persistent, and unrelenting. Callahan moved slowly through the corridor leading to the hospital's old pathology wing. The walls here were a faded cream, scuffed at knee height, with faint water stains tracing irregular paths down to the baseboards. The air smelled cooler, drier, carrying a faint odor of formaldehyde that had clung to the walls over time, subtle but persistent. She ran a fingertip along the edge of the railing as she passed, noting a layer of dust disturbed in patches, tiny arcs as if someone had leaned here recently. A door labeled records, restricted, stood slightly ajar. She nudged it open and stepped inside. The room was narrow, the low hum of a single fluorescent light above soft and uneven. Shelves lined the walls, filled with old slides, glass vials, and folders with faded labels. Some of the glass containers had a faint residue, a white powdery trace, barely perceptible but catching the light at certain angles. She leaned closer, brushing her finger lightly along the edge of one shelf, feeling the cold, smooth glass and faint grit where residue had settled. Near the back, a small stool was tucked under a counter, the rubber tips of its legs worn unevenly. The floor beneath bore faint scuff marks, irregular in pattern. She crouched, following them with her eyes, and noticed a thin line of dust swept aside, almost deliberately, forming a trail toward a corner cabinet. The cabinet's latch was slightly bent, as if someone had forced it open gently, leaving no obvious sign of tampering. She opened it slowly. Inside, Small boxes of slides were neatly stacked, but one had been shifted slightly, leaving a faint fingerprint smudge along the cardboard edge. She made a note of the location and the time, pressing the edge of the box lightly to preserve the print. The faintest smell of varnish or preserved tissue lingered, sharp in the otherwise quiet space. She straightened, brushing at her sleeves, and noticed a tiny piece of folded paper on the counter, almost transparent, tucked beneath a glass dish. The edges were worn, curling slightly. She lifted it carefully, feeling faint indentations pressed into the surface, lines of writing that had been erased or transferred elsewhere, visible only under careful attention. Callahan left the pathology wing and walked down toward the hospital's mechanical room, a labyrinth of pipes, valves, and large water tanks. The air here was damp, smelling of warm metal and rust, with a low, continuous hiss of escaping pressure from somewhere overhead. She noticed one valve handle slightly turned from its standard position, the metal cold and smooth in her hand. She pressed her finger along its edge and found a faint smudge, oil or residue from a gloved hand. She rotated it gently and traced the pipe back, noticing a small loop of tubing tucked behind the main lines, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. From the corner of her eye, she saw a narrow service door, partially hidden by pipes. She pushed it open and stepped into a supply alcove. The smell of cardboard, rubber, and faint cleaning solution filled the air. Shelves were stacked with spare tubing, gloves, and 4 bags. One bag, resting on the very top shelf, had a small crease at the corner where the plastic had been pinched. She lifted it, careful not to disturb the rest, and noticed the connector tip was slightly worn, as if it had been repeatedly attached and detached. Later, Callahan wandered into the hospital chapel again, drawn by a need to slow her thoughts. The air was warmer here, soft with the lingering smell of wax and polished wood. The kneeling benches bore faint impressions where people had pressed their hands over years, subtle indentations in the wood grain. She ran her fingers over one bench, noticing a small scratch along the edge, hidden unless viewed at the right angle. She crouched and noticed a tiny piece of thread caught in the grain, blue in color, not matching the fabric of any uniform she knew. She picked it up carefully and added it to her notebook. The sun had begun to rise outside, painting long, muted streaks across the floor. From the chapel window, she could see the faint shadow of the maintenance shed behind the hospital, its corrugated metal roof still wet from the rain. A ladder leaned against the wall, slightly askew, suggesting recent use. She made a note of the time and the location. Later still, she walked toward the hospital's service elevator, the doors cold and metallic. Inside, the floor smelled faintly of rubber and machine oil, the faint vibrations of the building carrying through the walls. She pressed the call button to the loading dock, noticing a small scratch near the keypad, a subtle mark that could have been overlooked by anyone in a hurry. She traced it lightly with her finger, leaving a faint smear, then stepped out. The dock was quiet, the smell of damp asphalt still lingering. A pallet had been shifted slightly, leaving a faint trail of powdery residue along the floor. Callahan knelt to inspect it, brushing her fingers along the edges, noting the direction of movement, the faint, uneven pressure marks. She stood, listening to the distant hum of ventilation and the occasional scrape of a cart in the hall above. The ordinary sounds somehow sharper in the quiet. Each small discovery layered over the last. The crease on the 4 bag, the smudges on the valve, the thread on the chapel bench, the powder on the floor, forming a lattice of subtle irregularities. None of them explained the missing medication, yet all of them hinted at movements, choices, and presences unseen. Callahan exhaled slowly, flipping through her notebook, letting the quiet weight of the day settle over her. Each sound, scent, and texture in the hospital seemed amplified now, each a potential clue pressed against the ordinary hum of the building. And somewhere, beyond the reach of her attention, the pattern continued to form, patient, deliberate, and invisible, waiting for someone to notice. Callahan moved along the narrow corridor that connected the old pathology wing to the outpatient clinics. The walls were painted a muted green, streaked in places where water had seeped from the ceiling tiles above. The smell of damp plaster mingled with faint antiseptic and the subtle tang of cleaning chemicals, an undercurrent she couldn't quite place. Her shoes scuffed lightly on the linoleum, the sound muted by the early morning quiet. She paused at a small break alcove, a space she hadn't noticed before, tucked between the exit doors and a supply closet. The counter was empty except for a single mug, tipped slightly on its side. She knelt, brushing her fingertips along the rim, and felt a faint stickiness, like dried sugar or syrup. The color was faint, almost transparent, but when she sniffed lightly, it carried a subtle, sweet medicinal scent she didn't recognize. A thin slip of paper was caught beneath the mug, partially folded. She lifted it, careful not to disturb anything else, and noticed faint pencil impressions pressed into it. The markings weren't words, exactly, more like a list of numbers, neat but tentative. She traced them lightly with her finger, feeling the tiny indentations. The numbers could mean almost anything, yet something about their spacing and sequence pressed at her attention. Callahan continued toward the outpatient wing. The smell of freshly brewed coffee floated through the air, mingled with the faint trace of antiseptic and the subtle dryness of sun-warmed floor tiles near the windows. She noticed that the door to the linen storage closet was slightly ajar, unusual for the morning shift, and the metal latch had a faint streak along the edge. She pressed lightly with a gloved finger and felt a residue, almost imperceptible, as if someone had handled it with care. Inside, stacks of folded sheets and gowns lined the shelves, but one shelf bore an irregularity. A pile of blue gowns had a small corner pressed down, the fabric slightly wrinkled, as if it had been disturbed recently. She lifted the corner carefully and found a tiny piece of hair, fine, blonde, caught in the fabric. She placed it into a small envelope, noting the location in her notebook. The corridor emptied into a small service courtyard, open to the sky but enclosed by high walls. The ground was damp, and the air smelled faintly of wet concrete and earth. A small bench sat near the wall, worn and weathered. She noticed a faint scratch along the edge of the wood, subtle and irregular, almost like something had been dragged across it. Beneath the bench, a small paper fragment had slipped under, partially hidden. She retrieved it carefully. It was blank, but the edges were frayed and soft, as if it had been handled frequently. A maintenance shed leaned against the far wall, corrugated metal dull in the morning light. A ladder rested against its side, slightly tilted. Callahan stepped closer and noticed faint footprints in the mud along the base, small and shallow, leading toward a side hatch. She followed them quietly, feeling the ground soft beneath her shoes, noting the irregular spacing of each step. The hatch was locked, but the padlock had a tiny scratch along its shackle, faint and almost imperceptible, as if it had been manipulated recently. Returning to the main building, Callahan entered the imaging suite. The air was cool here, with a faint chemical scent from the X-ray developing area and a subtle metallic tang from the equipment. A chair by the control console bore faint impressions along the vinyl seat, the kind left after someone had shifted their weight repeatedly. She ran her hands over it, feeling the subtle depressions. On the counter, a small stack of logs was slightly misaligned. One page bore faint smudges along the margin, the impression of fingerprints that had been wiped clean but were still visible under careful inspection. She leaned against the console for a moment, listening. The gentle whir of a ventilation fan, the soft click of a distant door closing, the faint hum of a monitor in the hallway beyond, it all pressed against her senses. Her eyes swept over the room again and caught a tiny vial tucked behind a piece of equipment, its label worn, almost unreadable. The liquid inside was clear, but the placement felt deliberate, hidden in plain sight. Later, she moved to the hospital's recycling room, a small windowless space lined with bins and crates. The smell here was sharp, of damp cardboard, plastics, and the faint lingering odor of cleaning solvents. One crate had been moved slightly out of alignment, its contents shifting to the side. She lifted a lid and found a torn corner of a chart, water-damaged but pressed with faint pencil indentations. She traced them lightly with her finger, noting the sequence in her notebook. Each small trace, each subtle irregularity seemed to echo the others. A fold in a sheet, a smudge on a counter, a faint scratch on wood. None explained the missing sedative. None revealed the full pattern. Yet in every corridor, every room, every overlooked space, the hospital whispered its quiet secrets, and Callahan moved through them, attuned to each imperceptible disturbance, each fragment that had been left behind. She paused at the loading dock again, noting the dampness along the concrete floor, the faint powder streaks from an earlier delivery, the soft echo of distant boots in the hall above. The ordinary sounds of the hospital, the hiss of a radiator, the scraping of a cart, the faint thrum of ventilation, had become a subtle map of movement, marking traces she could not yet interpret. And somewhere, beyond the reach of her senses, the deliberate choreography of small actions and tiny anomalies continued, patient and meticulous, waiting to be read. Callahan moved toward the hospital's endoscopy suite, a section she rarely visited. The corridor was narrower here, the walls pale gray with faint streaks where paint had peeled over time. The carpeted floor had been replaced in patches, the new tiles slightly shinier, the edges forming a subtle ridge that caught her shoe tips. The air was cooler, carrying a faint antiseptic scent, mixed with something organic, faintly sour, almost imperceptible unless you leaned close. A small window near the nurse's station showed the empty prep room. Callahan pressed her palm to the glass, feeling the cool surface, and noticed a tiny smudge in the corner, a fingerprint perhaps, or residue from gloves. She stepped closer, tilting her head to examine it, the fluorescent lights reflecting faintly across the pane. The smudge was irregular, the kind made by a quick, careful press. Inside the prep room, the counter was neat, but a tray of instruments had one small irregularity. A scalpel's tip bore a slight discoloration, a faint, gray streak along the metal. She touched it lightly with a gloved fingertip, feeling the subtle groove. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would trigger alarms, but it felt deliberate, out of place among the otherwise polished tools. She moved along the room, noting a small drawer slightly ajar. Inside, labels on medication vials were aligned, except for one, slightly askew. She lifted it carefully, examining the liquid inside. It was clear, but the stopper bore a faint scratch, almost like a nail's edge had grazed it. She recorded it in her notebook, noting time and location. The floor beneath the counter had faint streaks of dust, disturbed in an unusual pattern. She crouched, tracing them with her finger. They led toward the sink, then around a corner, stopping abruptly near a mop bucket tucked against the wall. The bucket was empty, but faint water stains radiated outward, almost like a hand had wiped at the floor, leaving an imprint in the subtle sheen. Callahan moved into the small staff break room adjoining the suite. The room smelled faintly of stale coffee and cleaning solution. A single chair was tilted back slightly, as though someone had leaned against it and pushed off quickly. On the table, a thin ribbon of paper had curled at the edges. She picked it up carefully. Faint indentations were pressed into its surface, almost imperceptible numbers, like the ones she had seen in the break alcove. She traced them lightly with her fingertip, the faint impressions raising more questions than answers. Later, she wandered toward the hospital's rooftop ventilation area, a small, gated section with heavy grates and coil pipes. The wind was stronger here, carrying the faint smell of wet metal and rain from the night before. She crouched by a coil of tubing and noticed a faint streak of oil, not fresh but still tacky. It led toward a vent grate, slightly shifted from its usual position. She nudged it gently, listening for any change in sound, and found a faint scrape along the metal edge, subtle enough to have gone unnoticed by routine checks. From the roof, she looked across the adjoining hospital wing. The early morning light caught a ladder propped against the maintenance shed below, the rungs damp and leaving dark streaks where boots had pressed. The ground bore faint scuffs that disappeared under shadows, suggesting movement that had been deliberate but careful. Back inside, she moved through the radiology department. The faint hum of machines and cooling fans filled the narrow spaces between equipment. She paused by a small storage closet, its door slightly open, revealing stacked protective gowns. One pile had a corner pressed down, subtle as a fingerprint on glass. When she lifted it carefully, a small piece of blue thread fell out, curling lightly on the floor. She placed it into her notebook. Later, in the hospital's rarely used quiet room, she noticed a small table by the window. A cup of tea had cooled, abandoned, the rim carrying faint lipstick marks she didn't recognize. The sun struck the table at an angle, catching dust motes in the air. She tilted her head to examine the surface and noticed a small smear along the edge. A faint, sticky residue, barely visible. She touched it lightly with a gloved fingertip, noting the sensation. Each trace, fingerprints, scratches, smudges, faint residue, displaced objects, seemed to accumulate into a subtle pattern across the hospital. None spoke loudly. None revealed the missing sedative directly, but together they pressed on her awareness, a quiet insistence that movement and choice had occurred, unnoticed by others. Callahan paused in the quiet room, letting the hum of distant ventilation, the soft echo of footsteps far down a corridor, and the faint metallic scent of the building settle over her. Each small observation felt like a thread she could follow, though the tapestry remained incomplete. Somewhere beyond the walls, in hidden spaces and ordinary routines, the invisible movements continued, slow, deliberate, and patient, waiting to be traced. Callahan moved into the hospital's old boiler room, a low-ceilinged space tucked beneath the main corridors. The air was heavy, warm and metallic, carrying a faint tang of rust and oil. Pipes ran along the walls in irregular angles, some insulated in fraying fabric, others bare and slick with condensation. Her shoes echoed softly on the concrete floor, the sound swallowed quickly by the space's cavernous corners. Near the back, a small access panel had been removed, leaving the opening dark and shadowed. She knelt to examine it, brushing her fingers along the edges. The metal was cool, with faint scratches along the lip, irregular and deliberate. Inside, a small coil of wire protruded from the wall, frayed at one end, as if it had been tampered with and then left. She traced it lightly, feeling the tiny texture of the exposed strands, noting in her mind that someone had been here recently enough for the metal to retain warmth. She moved to the opposite side of the room, where a narrow shelf held an assortment of spare gauges and fittings. One gauge had a faint smear along its glass surface, circular and almost imperceptible. She pressed her gloved fingertip to it, feeling the subtle residue of oil. The air was heavy and humid here, and the slight metallic taste clung to the back of her throat. Later, she found herself in the hospital's administrative wing, passing a long row of offices. The carpet was soft underfoot, muted in sound, but faint impressions were visible where chairs had been shifted frequently. A door with a small brass nameplate caught her attention. It was slightly ajar. She pushed it open carefully. Inside, a desk lamp had been left on, casting a pool of warm light on a neat stack of papers. Among the papers, a small envelope lay at the edges worn. She lifted it carefully, revealing a folded slip of paper pressed inside. The writing had been erased lightly, leaving faint indentations, almost like a shadow of words. She traced them slowly, feeling the lines under her fingers. Nearby, a coffee cup sat on a coaster, rings left in the lacquered surface faint but present, suggesting it had been placed deliberately rather than absent-mindedly. Callahan drifted down another corridor toward a seldom-used consultation room. The blinds were drawn, leaving narrow streaks of light across the floor. Dust motes floated lazily in the beams. A chair was tipped slightly forward, its legs scuffed along the edges. She ran her fingers along the worn edges, noting small flecks of paint, tiny abrasions that suggested someone had leaned against it repeatedly. On a small table, a jar of pens sat upright, but one pen was missing. She lifted the jar and noticed faint scratches inside the rim, as though the pen had been twisted or removed hurriedly. The plastic casing of the remaining pens carried a subtle layer of residue, hand lotion, perhaps, or faintly transferred oil. Later still, she wandered into the hospital's garden atrium, a space filled with muted greenery. The air was warmer here, humid from a small fountain at the center. Leaves glistened with lingering rain droplets, and the stone tiles beneath her shoes were cool and damp. Near a bench, a small smear of soil had been brushed against the base of a planter, as though someone had knelt or leaned there recently. She pressed a fingertip into the streak, feeling the gritty texture, noting it in her notebook. At the far end, a narrow path led to a small shed used for storing garden tools. The wooden door was slightly warped, a sliver of light escaping through the crack. Inside, rakes and spades were stacked neatly, except for one trowel that had been set aside, its handle bearing a faint smear of dark residue. She lifted it gently, noting the weight and texture, the subtle impression that it had been used recently for more than ordinary gardening. Returning indoors, Callahan stopped by the hospital's mailroom. The air was warm, carrying the faint scent of paper and glue. A sorting table had a small stack of envelopes misaligned, one resting slightly askew. She picked it up carefully. The edges were worn, and a corner had a faint crease, as if folded under pressure repeatedly. Inside, a blank sheet bore faint pencil indentations in irregular lines, pressed but erased, almost like a hurried note someone had tried to remove. Each of these small details, quiet and subtle, pressed against her awareness. The faint residues, smudges, impressions, and displacements built a lattice of unseen activity that no one else seemed to notice. Callahan paused in the corridor, listening to the soft echo of distant footsteps, the hiss of the ventilation system, and the muted thrum of hospital machinery. Each sound, smell, and touch seemed amplified now, each detail a thread in a pattern she could feel but not yet name. Somewhere, in these quiet, overlooked spaces, movement continued. Patient, deliberate, and unobserved, leaving traces for someone paying attention, traces she intended to follow. Callahan pushed open the door to the hospital's seldom-used medical library, a quiet space tucked between the administration offices and the old lecture hall. The air was cool and dry, carrying the faint mustiness of aging books, mixed with a trace of polish from the wooden shelves. Sunlight filtered through tall, narrow windows, casting muted beams that highlighted the subtle dust settling in corners. She walked slowly between the aisles, her fingertips grazing the spines of journals and reference texts. A faint scratch ran along the edge of one shelf, subtle, like a fingernail or a ring catching the wood. She paused, crouching to examine it. The scratch extended toward the back of the row, leading to a small, almost hidden cabinet built into the wall. Its latch was slightly crooked, and the paint around it had tiny flecks missing. She pressed lightly, and it opened with a soft creak. Inside were stacks of old records and binders, most labeled meticulously, one slightly askew. She lifted it carefully, noticing a faint smudge along the edge of the cover. The paper inside smelled faintly of coffee, the pages warped slightly where a liquid had been absorbed long ago. She flipped gently, finding a small slip of folded paper tucked between two sheets. The edges were frayed, the writing faintly pressed into the paper. She traced the lines with her fingertip, the indentations almost too subtle to notice at first glance. A narrow staircase at the rear of the library led to a mezzanine overlooking the reading tables below. The steps were worn, uneven, each one slightly different in depth and texture. She ascended slowly, feeling the variation beneath her shoes, noting the faint trace of dust disturbed along the center of each step. At the top, a small alcove held a wooden chair pushed into a corner. The legs bore faint scuff marks, and the seat carried an irregular imprint, as if someone had shifted weight repeatedly while leaning forward. She stepped onto the mezzanine platform and noticed a small hatch in the floor near the railing. It had been recently painted over, but the hinges bore faint fingerprints and smudges, darker against the pale coat. Kneeling, she lifted it slowly, revealing a narrow crawl space beneath the floorboards. Inside, faint dust patterns suggested careful movement, almost as if someone had crouched and shuffled quietly. The air smelled faintly of sawdust and something metallic, sharp and subtle. Descending back to the main floor, she wandered toward the hospital's rarely accessed utility corridor. The walls were concrete, cold and slightly damp, the faint smell of rust and lubricants clinging to the air. A row of circuit panels lined one side, each switch labeled with tiny letters. One panel bore a faint smear along its edge, a mark as if someone had handled it with gloved or damp hands. She pressed lightly with her fingertip, feeling the residue. At the far end of the corridor, a small door led into a narrow ventilation maintenance space. The air here was warmer, thick with the metallic tang of machinery and the faint dryness of dust. Pipes coiled along the ceiling, carrying faint echoes of airflow. A small ladder leaned against one wall, its rungs worn smooth in irregular patches. She climbed it carefully and noticed a tiny wire protruding from a vent grill, frayed slightly at the end. She traced it with her finger, feeling the subtle texture of insulation and copper strands. Later, she moved into the hospital's small, underused conference room. The blinds were partially closed, the room dim, with dust floating in the thin shafts of sunlight. A long table bore faint rings of cups, some overlapping, suggesting small, careful movements over time. One chair was slightly off angle, the legs worn unevenly. On the floor, a tiny fragment of paper had slipped beneath the radiator. A corner curl, faintly sticky, bearing a single pencil indentation, she traced slowly. From the window, she could see the courtyard below. The fountain's water rippled in faint concentric circles, disturbed only by a stray leaf. Along the pathway, faint smudges of mud traced a path toward a side door leading to the maintenance shed. The patterns were irregular, the spacing inconsistent, suggesting hurried but careful steps. Back in the hospital, she drifted to the imaging supply room. The air smelled faintly of plastic and cleaning chemicals. A shelf of sterile covers bore one irregularity, a single cover with a tiny crease at the corner. She lifted it gently, noticing a faint mark along the fold, subtle, almost imperceptible. A small vial behind it had been nudged slightly forward, its cap bearing a shallow scratch along the rim. Every corner, every quiet room, every overlooked space seemed to hum with traces of careful movements. Fingerprints, smudges, subtle shifts in objects, tiny residues, all accumulated into a lattice of action that no one else could see. Each detail alone was insignificant, yet together they pressed a quiet insistence. Someone had been here, deliberate and precise, leaving fragments of presence that could only be noticed by patient observation. Callahan exhaled slowly, letting the stillness of the corridors settle over her. The soft hiss of ventilation, the distant scrape of a cart in another wing, the faint hum of machinery. Each sound now mapped onto her awareness, each scent, each texture, each subtle mark becoming a piece of a quiet, unfolding puzzle. Somewhere, unseen, the pattern continued, careful, unhurried, and persistent, waiting to be traced. Callahan stepped quietly into the hospital's maintenance corridor behind the cafeteria, a narrow space she had rarely noticed before. The linoleum underfoot was worn smooth in patches, slightly darker where traffic had passed over time. The air was warmer here, tinged with the faint smell of grease and cleaning solution, and a persistent undertone of damp concrete. Small ventilation grates lined the lower walls, some rattling faintly with the building's pulse, while a single fluorescent light overhead buzzed low and uneven. A janitor's cart sat against the wall, its wheels leaving faint streaks of dust across the floor. She crouched to inspect them, noticing one wheel had a thin smear of dark residue that didn't match the rest. It extended toward a door labeled storage, mechanical supplies, which was slightly ajar. She nudged it with her shoulder, careful not to make a sound. Inside, shelves of pipes, tubing, and fittings were stacked neatly, except for one box shifted forward. She pulled it out and found a small coil of clear tubing, its surface lightly scuffed and bearing tiny streaks, as if something had been run through it repeatedly. Exiting the storage room, she passed a wall-mounted bulletin board. Old memos and notices hung in orderly rows, yet one corner held a small, curled paper, pinned haphazardly. She lifted it carefully and found a list of dates and times, handwritten in faint pencil, the markings partially erased. She traced the lines lightly with her gloved finger, feeling the subtle impressions beneath the paper's surface. The sequence was irregular, some entries heavier than others, suggesting it had been updated inconsistently. She continued down the corridor to the hospital's rarely used conference suite, its carpet muted underfoot. The air here was cooler, carrying the faint scent of polish and fabric from chairs long unoccupied. A long table stood in the center, scattered with remnants of an abandoned meeting. An empty notebook, a pen with its cap missing, and a single paperclip twisted oddly, as though someone had fiddled with it absent-mindedly. She knelt to inspect the paperclip and noticed a small smudge of faint blue ink along the curve, likely transferred from a previous use. Beyond the conference room, a narrow door led to a small elevator shaft maintenance area. The space smelled faintly of lubricating oil and metal, with dust motes floating in the weak light. She crouched to examine the base of the elevator rails and noticed a fine powder along the edge, disturbed in a subtle trail. She followed it with her fingertip, feeling the uneven distribution, noting how it led toward a service hatch at the far corner. The hatch was closed, but the latch bore a faint fingerprint, blurred slightly as though it had been hurriedly wiped. Later, she found herself in the hospital's seldom-used meditation room. The air here was warmer and still, scented faintly with candles that had long since burned down. The cushions were arranged neatly, yet one carried a small indentation, as if someone had knelt or leaned on it briefly. On a narrow ledge, a small stone sculpture had a faint streak of dust along its base, smudged in a way that suggested it had been moved recently. She pressed lightly against the sculpture, noting the subtle movement of dust under her fingertip. From the window, she could see the narrow service alley outside, lined with dumpsters and utility boxes. A faint trail of debris led from the alley toward a side door into the hospital's back corridors. The pieces were small: a scrap of paper, a dropped rubber glove, a streak of what looked like powdered residue. Seemingly insignificant, but forming a quiet, almost imperceptible path. Callahan drifted into the hospital's rarely used linen room, the air cool and dry, carrying a faint scent of bleach and fabric softener. Shelves of neatly folded sheets lined the walls, yet one shelf bore a small irregularity. A corner of a folded sheet pressed down unnaturally, creating a slight crease. She lifted it gently and discovered a tiny thread, pale and frayed, caught between the layers. She placed it carefully into her notebook, noting the exact location. Later, she moved along the back corridor toward the loading bay. The floor was faintly wet from overnight cleaning, reflecting the muted light of overhead fixtures. A small stack of crates had been shifted slightly, leaving a trail of scuffed linoleum behind. She knelt to inspect the marks and noticed subtle indentations, consistent with something heavy being dragged carefully. A faint smear of residue clung to one edge of the crate, as if gloves or hands had touched it recently. Each observation, each trace, smudges, scratches, displaced objects, tiny residues, added to the lattice of activity across the hospital. None explained the missing sedative directly. None revealed the full pattern, yet together they whispered a quiet story of deliberate movements, careful timing, and unseen presence. Callahan paused at the end of the corridor, letting the ambient sounds settle around her. The soft hiss of a distant radiator, the faint echo of boots on linoleum, the subtle vibration of mechanical hums through the walls. Each subtle detail layered over the next, forming a quiet insistence that someone had been moving through the building in ways no one else noticed, leaving tiny, deliberate traces waiting to be read. Callahan moved through the hospital's rarely accessed pathology wing. The corridor narrower here, with walls painted in a pale, washed-out beige that had faded unevenly. The linoleum was scuffed, a patchwork of worn areas where carts and foot traffic had repeatedly pressed. The air was cooler, carrying a faint metallic tang that mingled with the mustiness of old tiles. Faint echoes traveled from the adjacent labs, the soft click of machinery or the distant hiss of compressed air. A small supply closet caught her attention. Its door, usually flush with the frame, had a slight gap, letting a sliver of dim light escape. She eased it open and noticed a pile of trays stacked on the bottom shelf, one slightly misaligned. The metal of the tray bore a faint streak along the edge, dull and almost imperceptible, like a smudge of dust or residue from gloves. She touched it lightly, feeling the subtle texture under her fingertips. In the back corner, a small desk sat against the wall. Papers were stacked neatly, but one corner of the top sheet was bent slightly upward. She leaned closer, finding a faint impression pressed into the paper, not words but a sequence of small, deliberate dots, like someone had mapped something out and then erased the markings. She traced them lightly, noting the spacing and rhythm. She continued down the corridor to a small mechanical alcove where pipes coiled along the ceiling and walls. The air smelled faintly of lubricants and warm metal. One valve had a faint smear along its handle, subtle and uneven, suggesting it had been turned recently. She jostled it gently. It resisted slightly, leaving a small scuff on her glove, dark against the pale metal. Later, she moved into the hospital's loading corridor behind the cafeteria. The linoleum here was wet from early morning mopping, and the air carried the scent of cleaning chemicals mixed with faint, earthy traces from deliveries. A crate had been shifted slightly, leaving subtle drag marks across the floor. She followed them carefully, noticing the path led to a narrow side door, usually locked, which now bore faint scratches near the latch. In a seldom-used staff lounge adjoining the corridor, she found a chair tilted slightly against a table. Its legs bore faint scuff marks, and the vinyl seat carried small depressions as if someone had been sitting and shifting in place. On the counter, a mug had dried streaks along its rim, faint brown traces that suggested coffee or tea. She tilted it to inspect the bottom and noticed a tiny scratch along the ceramic, almost like a fingernail had grazed it. Callahan wandered next into the hospital's utility stairwell, a vertical shaft with concrete walls and exposed piping. The air was cooler, carrying a faint metallic tang and the smell of damp stone. The steps were worn and uneven, with faint streaks of dust disturbed along the edges. Halfway up, she noticed a small metal panel, slightly ajar. The hinges bore faint smudges, darker against the gray metal. She pressed lightly on the panel, feeling a subtle vibration through her fingertips, as if someone had recently adjusted something inside. Ascending to the mezzanine above the surgical wing, she paused near a small observation room. The glass was streaked faintly, a residue that caught the morning light at a narrow angle. She leaned close, tracing a finger along the streak and noticing the impression of something circular, like the bottom of a cup pressed briefly against the pane. Inside, a counter held neatly stacked charts, but one bore a tiny crease along the corner, faint but deliberate. She lifted it carefully, discovering a small scrap of paper tucked beneath, with the faint outline of erased numbers and letters pressed into the fibers. Later, she drifted into the hospital's rooftop garden, a small enclosed space with a stone path and a few potted plants. The air was warmer here, carrying the faint scent of wet soil and moss. Near a bench, a small leaf had been pressed flat against the stone, smudged with a faint residue, as though someone had brushed soil or dust onto it. The stone beneath bore subtle scratches, irregular, as if someone had knelt and shifted weight along the edge. Each trace she found, smudges, scratches, impressions, displaced objects, was quiet, almost imperceptible to anyone not looking closely. None answered the question of the missing sedative. None revealed the full pattern, yet together they wove a subtle lattice of presence, careful and deliberate, existing in spaces no one else noticed. Callahan paused at the far corner of the garden, listening to the distant hum of ventilation systems, the faint echo of footsteps far below, and the soft trickle of the fountain. Each sound and scent, each irregularity of surface and displacement of object, pressed against her awareness. Someone had moved here, slowly, deliberately, and left traces that could only be understood by patient, quiet observation. The pattern had begun, and the story was still unfolding. Callahan returned to the ICU, walking slowly past the softly beeping monitors and the faint scent of antiseptic. She paused outside the patient's room, letting her eyes drift across the bed, the neatly arranged linens, the four-stand with its empty bag of saline. Everything appeared ordinary, yet the memory of the subtle traces she had followed through the hospital lingered in her mind, a lattice of movements and intentions that had left almost nothing overt. She knelt beside the digital chart and traced the timestamps carefully. At first glance, they had indicated a continuous infusion, yet now she noticed a series of minor corrections, tiny edits that suggested someone had adjusted the entries manually, smoothing over gaps in the log. She compared them with the video footage she had reviewed repeatedly. No nurse, no technician, no one had approached the line at those times. A quiet thought began to form. These edits were deliberate, but the actions themselves had not occurred. She stepped back and remembered the patterns in the mechanical wings, the faint scratches on valves, the smudges on the elevator hatch, the subtle residue in the storage rooms. All of them had one quality in common. Nothing had been taken, nothing had been directly tampered with in a dramatic way. The traces were markers of presence, careful, invisible to casual observation. Her attention drifted to the medication cabinet in the ICU. The locks were modern, electronic, but the logs showed access during the night. She crouched to inspect the scanner pad and noticed the tiny wear on the keys, concentrated on a few buttons, the ones that corresponded to the day's usual schedule. A soft realization settled in. Someone had programmed the system to record interactions automatically, without actually touching the line. The empty bag of saline had been left in place intentionally, the chart edited to mask the absence of the medication. Callahan leaned against the wall, absorbing the quiet hum of the room. It became clear that this was not an act of violence or hurried malice, but one of meticulous manipulation. The sedative had not been delivered, yet the patient had remained stable because of the saline and vigilant monitoring. Whoever had intervened had been methodical, precise, and surprisingly patient. The evidence was subtle. Faint smudges, small scratches, displaced objects, each marking the passage of a person who moved carefully enough to leave nothing overt, yet left enough to be traced by attention and thought. She reviewed the faint pencil indentations, the erased notes, the lightly pressed fingerprints in dust, and the misaligned vials in storage. Each small anomaly connected. A hand had been here, a finger pressed lightly there, a pattern repeated over weeks. Gradually, the story emerged. It was someone familiar with the routines, aware of the digital systems, confident in their quiet interventions. Someone who moved through the ordinary rhythms of the hospital without raising alarms, but whose careful observations had left a quiet trail. Callahan pulled the patient's chart close and made a few final notes, linking timestamps to subtle physical evidence. She realized the person responsible was likely someone internal, someone who understood both the rhythms of care and the patterns of oversight. Their actions had not endangered the patient in a dramatic way, yet they had manipulated perception, crafting the illusion of a standard procedure. She stood in the quiet room, letting the soft beeping of monitors fill the space. The mystery, once fragmented across halls, closets, stairwells, and the rooftop garden, had begun to settle into a coherent picture. The missing sedative was not a story of chaos or sudden danger, but one of meticulous, almost invisible interference. Callahan finally exhaled, the tension in her shoulders easing. She straightened the bed linens, checked the empty saline bag one last time, and stepped back. Outside, the hospital hummed with its usual rhythm. The faint click of carts, soft footsteps, distant conversation. Nothing spectacular, nothing dramatic. Yet beneath it all, the quiet human presence she had traced through careful observation had revealed itself. The puzzle was complete in its subtlety. She left the room slowly, each step measured, allowing the quiet understanding of what had occurred to settle around her like the soft, steady hum of fluorescent lights in an empty corridor. The case was resolved not with confrontation, but with the patience of noticing, tracing, and reflecting, a quiet truth embedded in ordinary spaces, finally understood.